Warning: the following video contains spoilers for the Stephen King miniseries It, The Stand, The Shining, The Langoliers, Kingdom Hospital, Rose Red, Storm of the Century, and probably some others. So this is your warning. Hi, my name is Michael, and let's talk about Stephen King. He's one of the most well-known authors in the world, and has been for decades now, and ever since he began writing in the late 1960s, he has created a massive amount of novels and short stories, primarily in the fantasy, horror, and science fiction genres. And since the mid-1970s, people have been adapting his work into films and television series. And I wanted to talk about a lot of the Stephen King TV series that I grew up with from the late 80s to the early 2000s and how I feel about them. Because I think that Stephen King is an excellent author sometimes, and other times he's a passable author, a mediocre, interesting read. I'd go get it at the library but wouldn't rush out and buy it and spend my money on it kind of author. And a lot of the time he makes dross that really isn't very interesting and probably shouldn't be as prolific as he is.
For my 307th book, this couple is attacked by a lamp monster. Ooh.
But when he gets something really, really good and really, really right, it's absolutely amazing. It's incredible, and it's something you can devour over and over again. And during the 90s, there was a spate on TV of making these never-ending miniseries, of trying to use the medium of television not to make TV movies, but starting especially in the early 80s and then reaching a fever pitch when I was a kid in the 90s, we got to see all of these 4- and 6-hour miniseries, and they made a ton of them from Stephen King works. And they were kind of a mixed bag. They hadn't really quite figured out how to adapt something nowadays like they can on Netflix or HBO, to where it's a certain pitch-perfect skill at making a Stephen Kingsian horror sci-fi thing, sort of like Stranger Things is. But without further ado, let's talk about the ones I've seen and had a big impact on me when I watched them as a kid. Stephen King's It. This was released in 1990, and it's one of the most famous adaptations of a Stephen King work, especially on TV, especially because a movie version of it was released last year. The story follows a group of children in the 1950s who are forced to confront an evil Lovecraftian entity that has been stalking and murdering children throughout their tiny little hamlet over the past few hundred years at least. The children are a bunch of outcasts and nerds and losers who form a band of brothers together with one another to fight back against bullies and then use it against the evil force stalking the town in the form of Pennywise the Clown. Right away, I do enjoy this. I like the first part of this. It's divided into two segments. The first half shows the children in the 1950s fighting it when they're kids, and then it shows the kids in the 80s, as they've grown up, returning to the town of Derry to fight it yet again. And the kids segment is really well made. It has sort of a feel of the Goonies and some Steven Spielberg movies of the time that I didn't really necessarily understand when I was a kid, but now looking back I realize that that was seemingly a heavy influence of these kids teaming up together and forming this band to go on this adventure in this small town. And all of the child actors are really good. That won't always be the case in these adaptations, by the way, as we'll get to later. But the kids are excellent, and to find an ensemble cast, to find one good child actor is amazing, but an entire ensemble cast of them, that's very impressive. And they all do their part very well. You really feel that these kids know each other, genuinely are friends. They're all charismatic, all interesting, and all fun characters to watch. And you really feel the terror as they go through this hideous nightmare of trying to fight this evil, horrendous monster. It feels very childish. It's not really scary in any way, shape, or form. It likes to terrorize the people that it's going to eat. So it invades these kids' minds, finds what would make them absolutely horrified, and then shows it to them. And in many cases, it's actually quite ridiculous. One kid sees a mummy, like literally from the film The Mummy, which I don't know if it was really ever that scary. I was a little scared of The Mummy as a kid, but I think most people were not. It just comes off as ridiculous in this movie. There's another scene where Pennywise is wandering around and turns into a dog-headed monster. And this looks freaking ridiculous. I mean, it's laughable that they would do this. So unfortunately, it, in both of its segments, kind of falls into a very familiar category for me of a horror movie or television show that isn't actually scary. Now, that doesn't preclude me from liking something. I don't find Stranger Things to be scary, but I think it's good. But even as a kid, I wasn't scared of it. It never frightened me, even back then. It was just so bland and badly done when they were trying to frighten people. It felt like an episode of Tales from the Dark Side, the show back then, or even an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? In fact, there were episodes of Are You Afraid of the Dark that actually scared me, unlike in It. So they kind of failed on that front, but they succeeded on more of an adventure story-based, Goonies-type adventure in the first half, which was enjoyable watching these kids figure out a way to fight and kill this hideous entity. Unfortunately, everything breaks down in the second half where we see the adults. Now, none of the actors here are bad per se in their roles, but none of them are very good either. Even John Ritter from Three's Company, he's not even very good. None of these people really convey the very complicated, melodramatic emotions that they're going through without it seeming like a soap opera, where, you know, the woman has like an abusive husband, and this one guy is sleeping around with a bunch of women and is getting drunk, and this other guy's sort of going crazy. One of the characters actually kills themselves at the beginning of this, and we don't really get a sense or a feeling of why. We don't understand that, as we do in the book, that he's sort of gradually lost his mind over time because of his interaction with it, and it just comes off as kind of bizarre and not really unsettling, but just sort of uncomfortable to watch it. There are a lot of sequences in both halves of this that are just sort of like goofball stuff. It really feels like a sitcom from the late 80s, when they're just sort of wandering around this diner, having fun, laughing and joking about being kids. None of it really comes across as if they have an understanding of atmosphere. That is the unspoken mood of the room, which you have to kind of read and watch, which is really what makes all horror. You have to have an uncomfortable, dark, tonal nightmare that makes movies like Blue Velvet, for instance, that David Lynch did. That entire movie has the tone of a horror movie. It's very grim and unpleasant and kind of frightening when you're anywhere doing anything. But in this movie, it just feels like they're laughing and joking and having fun most of the time. And when they actually encounter it, especially in the second half, it has given up its attempts to look like the Mummy and is just wandering around as a clown. Now, clowns, I suppose, in certain circumstances can be scary, but I've never found them inherently frightening or disturbing, just sort of ridiculous looking. They're not funny either. They got Tim Curry to play Pennywise the Clown, and Tim Curry is great. He's absolutely amazing and just full of life and energy. But he's not frightening, ever. Like, ever. He just ends up being idiotic and ridiculous. Now, the book that it was based off was a gigantic, hundreds and hundreds of pages of story here that you could really sink your teeth into over a long period of time. And you really felt when you were reading it like you were there with these kids. And that experience is ruined when you spend even a fairly long amount of time as this miniseries does. They were originally going to make it into a 9 or 10 hour television series directed perhaps by George Romero, the director of Night of the Living Dead, and that would have been so much better than what we got here. It's not scary. The adult characters are not very good. Their entire sequence doesn't seem frightening at all, and laughing and clowning around like idiots doesn't really make sense. It's almost like they took the kids' adventure story of the 1950s segment and just decided to do the adult segment in the exact same way. It doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous. So it ends up not really being very scary, not being really very interesting, and aside from some minor interest in the first half, which I do enjoy watching at times, I can't really recommend this one. I don't think it's done very well. I haven't seen the movie that they made of it recently. I plan to, though. But yeah, this whole thing was a long, long disappointment, and that's not getting into some of the ridiculous stuff surrounding Bill's wife, who's this weird, uncomfortable appendage attached to the story. Oh, by the way, it is a giant spider. And yes, this is canonical in the book, but it is sort of like a weird extra-dimensional entity that really has no form or shape to human beings, and it sort of takes on forms of what people see. It's the evil in men's minds that it takes the shape of, in a way. But when we actually see it, at the end of the series, and it's just a giant, very badly animated, like claymation-looking spider, it just looks so stupid. I can't believe it. And, they just can't match Stephen King's writing. They can't get it right. Yeah, this was a real disappointment.
Now you see it, now you don't. It has returned with vengeance. It is evil personified.
I'll kill you all. I'm every nightmare you ever had.
The Golden Years. This one is not all that good. It's about an elderly janitor who works at a secret government lab who gets caught up in a chemical explosion and starts to age backwards. And he has to be tracked down and monitored by this evil organization that functions a lot like the Syndicate did in the X-Files. In fact, it has a very X-Files feel, and this is a couple of years before the X-Files. Felicity Huffman is in it, and she's playing a government agent that looks almost exactly like Scully. Like, she looks eerily like Dana Scully from the X-Files. It has a kind of Incredible Hulk kind of feel, like the Incredible Hulk TV series about somebody who's constantly running away from his past, in this case the government. They're always trying to track him down, and he's trying to avoid them. It has a real feel of a sort of a late 60s type of sci-fi thing, sort of like The Invaders. It doesn't really feel... It has an odd modernity to it, because it was supposedly based a little bit, according to Stephen King, on Twin Peaks. Like, that was the impetus to put this on there. Although it feels like Twin Peaks without all of the interesting bizarreness to it, just with the leftover kind of military subtext from the second season. And the overall, the main story of this guy running away is just an irrelevant plot device that really doesn't need to be there and isn't very exciting. It's not like an underground revolutionary cell trying to fight the government guys. It's just so boring to have this sort of ridiculous character who's like a 70 or 80-year-old guy, and he has his wife with him, but he's getting younger and she's still old, I think. None of it really worked out. It just ended up being sort of the pilot for a series that never happened, and it probably never should have happened. There were some interesting little ideas and bits and bobs there, probably made in the wake of Twin Peaks, but before the X-Files figured out how to make this kind of show. And, yeah, it's really not worth watching except as a weird curiosity of the very early 90s, like the George H.W. Bush early 90s.
From the master of mystery, Stephen King takes you on this summer's most shocking journey.
What is wrong with my husband?
Something happened to him. When a man discovers there is something more frightening than growing old.
You don't look the way you did 2 weeks ago. You look the way you did 2 years ago.
Growing young.
The Tommyknockers. Is this the worst one? It may very well be the worst one. Now, the story based on the Tommyknockers is not bad. Like a lot of this, the original work is actually interesting. However, this adaptation of it is terrible. It's a story about a group of people in small-town Maine who discover a group of aliens. And these aliens allow them to become really, really creative. However, they wither their minds and bodies as they do so. So someone could become an amazing painter or writer, but access to this strange alien technology begins to corrode them and sort of drain away their life force or eat them. And it's a super, super, super obvious metaphor for drug abuse, even though King claims that he wrote this without understanding it. He had a drug abuse problem at the time when he wrote this, back in the 80s, I think. And the idea is that you do this drug, and it makes you able to do all of these wonderful artistic things, but it's going to kill you. It's not exactly the most sophisticated or interesting plot or story. The subtext isn't interesting. The execution of it, however, is the worst, I think the worst of any of these. It is a comedy, essentially. It's a Stephen King story, but it's a goofball comedy. In some ways, it reminds me of another horror writer, H.P. Lovecraft, who made a story that had sort of a comic feel to it, The Colors from Outer Space. and it sort of prefigured a lot of the 1950s-ish style aliens invade Earth kind of feel to it, and this feels a lot like that. It just feels like a cheesy cornball kind of thing from the 50s that was changed a little bit for modern times. The characters are all portrayed horribly. Every single person in this is a terrible actor. They don't even have the thing like with The Stand where there's like a couple of good ones. They're just all terrible. They're either... Now, I'm not saying that every single one of them is a terrible actor outside of this, but in this one, they either had awful material or the director just did not know what the heck to do with them, and they behave as if they're on a sitcom. They are so over the top, so comic, so ludicrous. It just doesn't make any sense. Like this postman who is cheating on his wife with another post office worker, portrayed by Tracy Lords, of all people, and she isn't exactly a great actress, plays this alcoholic author who's supposed to be, of course, an analog for Stephen King, and he's just, everything about his scene is done so terribly. He's supposed to be a drunkard, and he makes a jerk of himself at this award ceremony he's supposed to be at, and he actually jumps through a window somehow. He looks absolutely idiotic throughout this entire movie, and everybody does. One of the main characters is a policewoman who has a gigantic, full wall-sized collection of porcelain dolls that she keeps in the police station. Now, I'm fond of a wacky police station, you know, like in Twin Peaks, but this just crossed a line into idiocy. All of this is badly done. The original story was not worth adapting. It certainly wasn't scary, which is, you know, maybe what people want to come to Stephen King for. I'm a big proponent of the old saying that if someone wants to eat pizza and you serve them Chinese food, no matter how good that Chinese food is, even if it's the best in the world, they came for pizza and they're going to be disappointed. And even if you try to be amusing in a Stephen King work, that's not what this is for. You didn't come here to laugh, you came here to be scared, to experience horror, or at least some sort of vaguely decent science fiction, but they just don't get it. It's not funny, it's not scary, I can't even take 1 second of it with even the faintest degree of seriousness. It's horrible, it's not even worth watching.
A hobby?
Oh, yes, they are my hobby. My friends know that I like them, so every time they travel, they bring me one.
My name is Jojo. They're bad. I'm scared.
The Stand. This one was a real issue. The Stand is probably Stephen King's most iconic work next to The Dark Tower. It's this gigantic 1,000-page long epic work that he made back in the 1970s and then later updated. It's a science fiction story about a terrible plague that descends across the world and wipes out 99% of the population of the entire planet. And in the United States, it follows the post-apocalyptic adventures of the survivors of this plague. And the people begin to gravitate to one of two new centers of post-plague civilization. There's Boulder in Colorado, and then there's Las Vegas in Nevada. One of which is sort of evil in Las Vegas, naturally, and one of which is sort of good in Boulder. And it becomes this weird, it goes from a science fiction story to being sort of a weird fantasy horror story as the devil or his minions may be involved in all of this, and maybe God punished us by sending the plague down to us. And it's this magnificent story, and they really, really utterly failed to tell it here in a few hours of TV. This is something that really probably could have had a couple of seasons, at least, maybe 2 to 3 seasons, of a, 10 episode per season television show. Like this, if this was on Netflix now, it might be a lot better. It didn't work for quite a number of reasons, one of which is something that had there's a big problem in the past couple of Stephen King television adaptations I've been talking about. The weird lighting. Everything here is way too bright. Everything just looks like it's lit so warmly. It looks just like another happy, regular day. This really seems like it's lit like in any episode of television, and there's no atmosphere or mood building anywhere. Just like with It, we don't really feel any kind of atmosphere of terror or horror or violence. Everything seems just like a bright, sunny, happy day. And that really kills the mood of what's going on here. They also did not have the ability to really showcase any of the horrors of the plague. It really looks like a really bad, low-tier episode of The X-Files at the beginning. And I do love The X-Files, but, it really feels like pathetic, bad TV in which the special effects just weren't quite there yet. They didn't quite know how to direct it properly at this stage. It really just doesn't look very good. So, there's no sense of terror or horribleness going on here, and it's magnified by another major issue, the casting. Whoever did the casting to this should be ashamed of themselves because they did a horrid, horrid job. Now, maybe back in the day, it wasn't at a time period where you can really find good actors for this kind of work, and it was sort of considered that this was the dregs of the acting field, and most people didn't go to it. But couldn't they have found some better people than this? And not everyone is terrible in this. Rob Lowe is okay as the deaf man. The guy, the mentally challenged guy that says M-O-O-N, that spells moon, that guy is actually not bad. Although his character is such a ridiculous Stephen Kingsian stereotype, it's kind of difficult to stay serious while watching him. The woman from the Saw movies, whose name escapes me, is pretty bad. Miguel Ferrer from Twin Peaks is, as always, fantastic, but virtually everyone else is horrid. The main devil guy, Randall Flagg, who you may know if you've read other Stephen King works, he is played by an absolutely horrible actor, or an actor, I should say, that is absolutely loathsome in this role. He doesn't come across as the devil. He looks like Mark McKinney pretending to be the devil on The Kids in the Hall. Like, he feels like a joke version of the devil on a sketch comedy TV show. He just looks ridiculous. He's not frightening. Nothing that he does is frightening. The crappy early 90s CGI is pretty pathetic, too. Laura San Giacomo of Just Shoot Me fame. I don't know if you can be famous for being on that show, because it was pretty bad and most people have forgotten it, but still, she's in this role as sort of like the devil's seducer who has to be this sort of like devilish, beautiful, evil woman. And I know this is being a little mean here, but she doesn't exactly pull off beautiful seducer very well, if you know what I mean. She's just not quite got the chops for that right here. In fact, a lot of the other characters are miscast. Gary Sinise, who has, he's this sort of, again, East Coast Italian-type actor, is supposed to play this sort of bumbling, middle America, rural folk-type guy. And he's really just none of the actors really fit their roles well. Later on in the story, a grand confrontation begins to occur between the remnants of good and evil. They begin to sort of stalk and fight one another and fall into the same patterns that brought the world to ruin originally, because the military created the plague that destroyed the world, and they start enacting the same sort of violent, aggressive, nationalistic kind of program that God apparently didn't like and killed all of us in order to stop, or something, I don't know. And the final end point with Max Headroom, there's no tension there. I'm not scared of anything or anyone. They didn't have the funds to pull this off. The camera work is really lazy. It's bottom tier, sort of Z grade. It looks like something you'd see on the USA channel, starring Lorenzo Lamas in the 90s. This is one of King's great works. It's absolutely magnificent, and maybe in the era of Netflix, where they're picking up these cool horror stories and Stranger Things is really popular, someone is going to take this story and do it justice, but they didn't do it with this. My God, was this miscast.
What? What did I do?
When you let me go upstairs without telling me, I could pop your neck like a dick. Maybe I should.
I tried to tell you.
The TV miniseries of The Shining. This is another one of Stephen King's most iconic works about a man named Jack Torrance and his family, his wife and young son, who go up into an isolated hotel deep in the mountains and are completely cut off from everyone else and have to contend with a group of evil ghosts running around trying to kill them. And my lord, I can't believe that Stephen King doesn't like the Stanley Kubrick version, but it's well known that for many years he said he does not like that movie. Probably because Stephen King is crazy, I guess, or at least when it comes to movies or adaptations of his work, he's sort of blind. And so he insisted on making a new version of The Shining. This work is absolutely, utterly horrible in every conceivable way. It looks terrible compared to the original. There is absolutely no frightening ambiance in any way. Stephen King may know how to write something scary, but how to actually produce something on the screen that has frightful atmosphere, he does a horrible job. The hotel does not look scary in any way, shape, or form. It is not filmed successfully. There's also weird lighting issues again, where it looks a little bit too bright and happy in most scenes. The person playing Jack Torrance does a pretty bad job. I mean, he's not a terrible actor or anything, but he's competing with Jack Nicholson, for goodness sake. You don't feel that this guy is a crazy psychopath at any point. The kid playing Danny is alright, I guess. I mean, there's nothing bad about it, but he's just a little 5-year-old kid that he's supposed to be playing, so, you know, how could you go wrong with that exactly? Jack's wife is also mediocre, I guess. It's just that the story is so horrid. It's so unwatchably bad. It's hard to actually sit down and view it for any length of time because it's so achingly boring. They spend seemingly hours and hours talking about their relationship and how their marriage is collapsing, and it's like they go to couples therapy or something at one point. Maybe it felt like it, sure. I mean, it's just so mind-meltingly dull. They spend so much time on this crap, it's impossible to watch. And when they actually get to the scary stuff about the ghosts look as ridiculous and horrible as they possibly could be. Like a little kid wearing a sheet over themselves on Halloween and going as a ghost would be scarier than the ghosts in this movie. They're that terrible. There's nothing about the creepy weirdness, the eerie smiles, the strange inflection and idiom of the bartender that Jack meets, who chopped up his kids and he has this creepy smile going around on his face all the time. You know, it's unsettling and weird and memorable, but in this, they're just some random actors. They do a terrible job, they look horrid, and worst of all, the worst sin of this entire movie, the one thing where it makes it unforgivable, they give the ghosts a motive. I don't remember if the ghosts had this motive in the book, maybe they did, but the fact that, you know, Stephen King talks a lot about Lovecraft, but apparently he has not heard of the famous quote from Lovecraft that fear of the unknown is the strongest and most potent fear of all. And one of the reasons why something is scary is because we can't possibly understand why it's doing what it's doing. The ghosts in the original were doing something for totally mysterious, supernatural reasons. The idea of applying reason to it, it was impossible, it was ridiculous, you couldn't do it. But the ghosts in this one seem to be after world power or something. They're trying to take over, they're trying to expand their dominion beyond the house, I think, and they're using Jack to do that somehow. And it just gives us a little bit too much of a window into the world of these ghosts. It's kind of like the Rumpelstiltskin effect, you know, he has power over us because we don't know him, we don't know his true name. As soon as we know his real name, all of his power is gone. And the same thing with the ghosts. As soon as we know why they're doing what they're doing, all of their power to frighten or shock it just vanishes, it goes away. They're just trying to increase their potency in the real world or something, and they don't seem frightening at all. They seem almost joke-like when they're jumping around trying to get Jack to go and start this conflagration in the hotel, and they actually bring up the ridiculous boiler subplot of the Shining, which was in the book and unfortunately was barely touched on in the Stanley Kubrick movie, where Jack is supposed to be monitoring the boiler in the place and heating certain parts of the house, but he's been neglecting it and the whole place is going to blow up. But in this one, there's actually like a ridiculous cheesy action movie style conclusion where everything is going to blow up and the entire hotel is going to blow, and they should have had like a countdown timer on screen. Maybe they did, I don't know. But it felt like a laughable edition of the A-Team about, we're going to stop this thing from blowing up or we're all going to die. Oh no. It just seemed, it was so badly done, so horribly realized that, it's impossible to watch. It's long, agonizing, never even remotely close to ever being scary, and it has an idiotic postscript where the ghosts show up at Danny's graduation ceremony in the future. Nothing about this is good. It's unwatchable garbage. Stay far away from it.
We are the topiary creatures. We're very pleased to meet you, senors and senoritas too. The animals we feature, would never eat you. We sing so very sweet to you. Welcome to the zoo, zoo, with the kangaroos, roos, and the tigers too. Welcome to the zoo. So show them self-play lions. Come in and see our clients. Do not be the giant yaks.
The Langoliers. I'm going to sound like a bit of a hypocrite here to some people, but I absolutely love the Langoliers. This is great. I know I talked a lot of smack about the other ones for being cheap and bad looking and having terrible special effects, but there's just something about the Langoliers that clicks with me. It works. Stephen King is known for being able to write brilliant introductions to his work. And then afterwards, they just kind of spin out of control and end up being pretty bad towards the end because you realize he doesn't know where he's going, sort of like Lost and other things like that. But the Stephen King style, I think, really, really works in that introductory phase. He knows how to get you around the campfire with a blood-curdling introduction to a story, even before it, peters off into nothingness. The Langoliers is about a bizarre flight late at night of a passenger jet that is going across the United States, and a group of people on the flight fall asleep, and they wake up mid-flight to discover virtually everyone on the plane is gone, except for maybe 10 people, and they were all asleep during this. Thankfully, one of the people that was asleep is a pilot and is able to fly the plane, so they have to discover what exactly happened to them, save their lives, and fight off some very nasty creatures later on. And the beginning of the story, the first half of the miniseries, I think is brilliant. I love the setup, and I think this actually should be the setup for a new Stephen King series, but they would have to change what happened later on. This is one in which the acting is pretty bad. There's a little blind girl in this story, and remember what I said about how good the child actors were back in It? Well, this is sort of the punishment that Stephen King miniseries have to get after those really, really skilled and talented actors and actresses. Because this little girl is horrible. I can't imagine she's acted in anything else. And I don't think she's an actress anymore, and that's probably for the best. And she's just so bad at her role. She's just no good at this. She sounds every single line like she has no comprehension of what she's saying or why. And she's actually playing just a terrible character, this, like one of the most stock, stereotyped characters in writing history. The poor little blind girl who's on her way to have an operation to get her sight fixed. And it's just bad. And yet I still like it. I can ignore that crummy aspect to it, because the rest of it is just so mysterious. We do get to see Dean Stockwell, who has played Ben, the famous role in Blue Velvet, one of my favorite movies, and I really do like seeing him, and he's an excellent actor. And the other people are, they run the gamut from mediocre to terrible. There are these two guys, this one black guy and this one guy who's always eating, who we don't really learn very much about and are pretty pointless, and, they're pretty average. And then there's Nick, who's okay as this British spy slash assassin, and the pilot guy is okay. The elementary school teacher is also pretty bad, and these kids are pretty bad too. Again, it's very low tier, very bottom of the barrel kind of acting, and yet I kind of think it works for this. It really feels like exactly what it is, like a mid-90s made-for-television movie. And I'm really intrigued just by the mystery of the beginning, because it absolutely, completely feels like a Twilight Zone episode made for modern times. And Dean Stockwell actually was in a Twilight Zone episode back in the day. So it makes sense to see him there, and I don't know why. I can get into this story and this sort of spooky world, and I remember watching it as a kid and really, really enjoying it when I was younger, so there's probably a heavy nostalgia element onto it. It also has just something I'm really, really interested in, which is emptiness. I am just obsessed with huge places and buildings that are totally devoid of human life. And this features a ton of that. First, the plane, which of course we're accustomed to see packed with people at all times in a very claustrophobic way, and then later on at the airport they land in, which is totally empty. I really think it looks so cool, and it reminds me exactly of, like, they must have done this Twilight Zone episode with the same premise like 3 or 4 times, where there was a guy wandering around a town and it was totally alone, and he had to figure out why he was doing there. And even though they did it like 4 or 5 times in the same story and the same show, I still loved it because I liked that idea so much. Now, unfortunately, as much as I like the Langoliers, I do have to admit that there is a lot of awfulness within it, because when we actually find out what's going on, that's when the Stephen King blood-curdling story turns into the ridiculous crap that we know it tends to become. You see, Stephen King here did not have an ending to this, and he just made up some nonsense that was not scary or interesting or make even the faintest bit of sense in any way, shape, or form. You see, they find out what's been going on is they've actually traveled backwards in time a very short distance, maybe no more than a few seconds or a few minutes, back into the past, and they realize somehow that time travel in the Stephen King universe works in a really weird way, because somehow all of the people are gone when you travel into the past, but all of the stuff that was there, all of the buildings, the planet, the earth, the trees, everything is still there, and it has to be destroyed in some way. And the way it gets destroyed is because of creatures, the titular Langoliers, which are these absolutely horrible CGI effects. Stay away from CGI, everyone. I hate CGI anywhere, but mid-90s TV CGI is just horrible. I mean, the Langoliers themselves, I think they do an okay job building them up, but again, that's a trick of a yarn spinner like Stephen King, where he knows, just like H.P. Lovecraft did, how to set up a scary story, but no way to ever actually visualize it. The Langoliers that apparently travel through the past and eat all of the physical matter that for some reason still exists. Why does it still exist? Why don't people exist? Didn't the things travel into the future, or is it just living things? But there are plants there, and anyway, it doesn't make any sense. And the Langoliers are these giant flying meatballs with teeth on them that look horrid. It's ridiculous. You can laugh at them. It's terrible. And also, there's Balky. Bronson Pinchot shows up in this movie, and he really ruins the atmosphere. Once again, these they don't really know quite how to tell the atmosphere just right. And in this one, they actually do get the atmosphere kind of right with the spooky, empty Twilight Zonesian airliner in the dark late at night, and no one knows what's going to happen, and are they going to die, or are they part of some secret experiment from the government? It's completely weird, and yet it's actually kind of ruined by Balky, who runs around screaming like no one in real life would ever do in any way. This is just a classic Stephen Kingsian stereotype of a character, or is it more like how people interpret King's characters? I don't know. It's just so terrible and so over the top and so bad. It's just unwatchable. It's absolutely loathsome when he gets on the screen there. They could have done this character so much better. He could have been like a Professor Smith type character from the original pilot of Lost in Space this evil scumbag who gets on this ship and is planning to destroy and hurt people and is just acting like a complete maniac most of the time. They could have made this character a utterly loathsome psychopathic murderer. But instead, they actually try to show him having a dark past and explain why he behaves this way. And Bronson Pinchot just does this so badly, just does this so over the top. I mean, over the top doesn't even cover it. He's chewing the walls here. He's just not scary. He's just ridiculous. And someone needed to rein this guy in, but unfortunately they didn't have the talent or the foresight to do that. And we're stuck with this jerk trying to ruin the movie. Fortunately, I don't feel like he ruins it because I have a heavy nostalgic love for this. And, maybe I'm crazy, but, I like the Langoliers, crucify me in the comments if you want, but I like the Langoliers a lot.
Now, are you gonna look at the big picture, or do I have to let them have you? No, they don't even exist. You do whatever you have to do, and you get to Boston. Because if you don't, Craigie Waggy, they are gonna chew the eyes right out of your head.
And yet, amidst all of this bad work, which ranges from the mediocre to the dubious to the hilarious to the terrible, there is something that stands out from the rest of Stephen King's work here, and that is Storm of the Century. Released in 1999 and starring Tim Daly, it is the best thing that Stephen King has ever done for TV. It is an incredible story. The story takes place on a small island off the coast of Maine, and the experience this tiny island community goes through with an incredibly evil, hideous force that begins to stalk them during the worst blizzard they've ever experienced. The main character is Michael Anderson, the sheriff of the town, who ends up sort of acting as the moral lantern of the entire community. And the town braces for the terrible blizzard. Everyone starts to hunker down. Everyone starts to go over to the local town hall to get into the basement and wait out what is promising to be one of the worst storms anyone's ever seen. And it's on that day that a stranger comes to town and murders a local woman. An old woman he couldn't possibly have had any grudge against and probably didn't even know. And the sheriff has to figure out what the heck is going on and quickly learns that there is a supernatural element at play, as the murderer turns out to be some sort of demon or wizard or some sort of evil creature that he has to try to thwart. This tells an incredible story that has a powerful moral edge to it, and Michael Anderson, the sheriff, ends up acting as sort of the moral beacon for the town and trying to convince them to do good and to be good. And it ends up spending time focusing not just on the evil creature, but on the ability of the evil creature to see inside your mind and learn all of your darkest secrets. With those secrets, he finds out that the town is not the peaceful, happy, pleasant place that it seems, but is actually filled underneath, just under the surface, with violence, adultery, greed, lying, stealing, cheating, drug dealing, all of the very Twin Peaksian type stuff. And it's just an incredible story. It really, really works. It really sells you on how frightening this world is, and it's perfect to watch during a blizzard, during wintertime. Just hunker down when the snow starts falling and put in Storm of the Century. It's an incredible experience. The character of Mr. Linoge he's so horrifying, he's so spooky, he's actually frightening, unlike all of the other, like literally everything else in all of the other Stephen King miniseries. This is how you do a creepy supernatural entity right. He's amazing at this. He really makes you feel like you should be scared of him. And the ending, which I'm not going to spoil, is magnificent. And it shows who the real evil people are, and what it really means to be good in the face of darkness. Why was this one so much better than the others? Well, for one thing, Mick Garris, that guy who's been involved in so many of the other things, he's not involved in this, thankfully. He's a favorite of Stephen King's, but I don't think he should be. I mean, he certainly couldn't do what they asked him to do with the resources he had, or maybe he's just incompetent in general. The look and feel of this one is done perfectly. Unlike the weird lighting choices in the other one, you really get a sense of spooky, cold darkness on the streets of this town. The acting here, unlike most of the other ones, is phenomenal. They've picked great actors all around. And except for one or two little choices, nobody really hams it up too much and goes too crazy with it. Everyone does a really good job, and most of them feel like real people trapped in this extraordinary circumstance. Crucially, this was not created from a Stephen King book or short story. This was created by King totally out of nothing, and I think that's really the key here. He needs to do more stuff just out of whole cloth, just make it up out of nothing, rather than work on the painful process of adapting his own work, which may not be done to his satisfaction, even if he's the one responsible for the adaptation. And if he's not, someone could totally butcher the work. That really seems to be the key, but it's something you never really learned, and they just want to sell other stuff into adaptations, which is a little lazier and results in, well, obviously crap. And I highly urge anyone who likes any kind of horror television to check it out. It's one of the best I've ever seen on TV. It's called Storm of the Century, perfect for wintertime. Have a watch.
Robbie. I'll be waiting for you in hell, Robbie. And when you get there, I'm going to eat your eyes over and over, because hell is repetition. Born in sin? Come on in.
Now, oddly enough, after the success of Storm of the Century, a few years later, they decided to adapt Salem's Lot, I believe the earliest Stephen King television adaptation, which was on in the late 1970s, which is considered by some to be a classic, not by me though. And for some weird reason, the person who made Salem's Lot was heavily influenced by Storm of the Century. And they try this really horrible, ham-fisted attempt to insert a lot of the moralizing that was in that movie and worked so well in Storm of the Century into Salem's Lot, where it had absolutely no place. They make everybody in the town sort of a dissolute jerk, and the main character, really like nasty, cynical jerk who just sees everyone in the whole world as a bunch of evil jackasses all the time. And that's so weird. Why did they and that's not in the novel, by the way. They just injected this bizarre and uncomfortable thing from a previous Stephen King adaptation, which really worked, into this one where it really doesn't. Salem's Lot is about a group of vampires that are taking over a small town in Maine. It's not very good. It never interested me. It was never scary. I don't think the book was even very scary. It was really derivative and not really very interesting. I'm sorry if you like it, but I really, really hated it. It's not really worth even talking about much more. It's just so weird that they decided to do that. Rose Red. This one is another really lazy series, and it's just an example of why Stephen King should not write quite as much as he does. This is a pointless and boring story about a Victorian mansion that is haunted by spooky ghosts. And there's a team of researchers that are going in there that are trying to, like, record the ghosts and prove that ghosts exist, you know, which is, I think, the plot for, like, 1,000 horrible horror movies. And, of course, they go in there and it actually is haunted, and it just feels so ludicrous. Why would you spend, like, maybe 20 minutes of a Tales from the Crypt episode about this, I would expect, but hours and hours of a mini-series all about this? Most of the actors here are not terribly good in this, but they may have been good in something else. I think the woman from Beautiful Creatures with Kate Winslet from the early 90s is in this, and also the woman from I Married an Axe Murderer, which was a kind of an now obscure comedy from the early 90s. She plays the main woman in this, and it's just incredibly dull. It's just, you know, hour after hour of these idiots running around a mansion. And there's just, like, bargain basement Roger Corman movie effects from, like, the 50s of, like, windows opening and closing on their own, or wind blowing through I mean, it's just so community theater bargain basement crap. It's almost unwatchable. Why would they make this? It's so boring. I mean, maybe there are people that would be scared by this, but who? Are they comatose? Are they dead? Who would be scared by this? Why would you make this? I mean, this wouldn't even scare Victorian people, much less modern people. It's just, why in God's name was money and time and effort put into this? It's just dull, Oh.
Exciting? No, it's not. It's dull. 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 My God, it's dull. It's so desperately dull and tedious and stuffy and boring and desperately dull.
It's awful. I mean, I dare you to watch this and be entertained. You are one of the most unique beings that has ever existed. It's not scary. Maybe a 1950s Schlockmeister, sort of like The Haunting, could be made about this, but it's just bad. Just bad.
Houses are alive. If we're quiet, if we listen, we can hear houses breathe. We say haunted, but we mean the house has gone insane.
Kingdom Hospital. Oh boy, this is really the dregs of Stephen King's TV work. This did not actually begin its life as a Stephen King project. It was actually a TV show in the 1990s, created by Lars von Trier, the man who later went on to direct Antichrist and Nymphomaniac. And it's just terrible. It is an entire season this time of a TV show, not a miniseries. And it is about a spooky hospital, which is like one of the most generic horror settings you could ever have. Like, literally, it's one step away from saying a dark and stormy night in an old mansion. And it is about an artist, a painter, who was severely injured in a car accident, just like Stephen King was shortly before this was made. Stephen King, very famously, 20 years ago, was walking down the road, and someone crashed into him as he was out for one of his late-night fog walks, and a drunkard crashed into him, and he was severely injured at the time. People didn't know if he was going to live. It was a terrifying experience for him, and he just took that right out of his life and put it onto the screen here. And the series starts off kind of okay as we watch this painter go into the hospital, and he's comatose throughout virtually the entire series, and he begins in his coma to have these weird psychic visions. He sees a little ghost girl running around the hospital and weirdly sees an anteater walking around, which is pretty cool and kind of unsettling and a little off-putting there. But the series overall is absolutely unwatchably hideous. The stories very quickly bog down into nothingness as the wacky residents of this hospital, in true sitcom fashion, get into arguments with all of the doctors, and it just becomes a soap opera as the patients and the doctors are arguing all the time about money, and one of the doctors is a jerk, and bizarrely gets into this horrible fight with this homeless person outside the hospital, and we're instantly assumed that we should take the homeless drunkard side instead of the arrogant prick doctor, when I really didn't feel that way at all. The actual horror element is so thin and so badly done that a terminally anxious hypochondriac would not be scared of this. There's nothing frightening about it at all. There seems to be some story, and I'm straining my memory even to remember what it is, but a bunch of children may have been killed at the place during the Civil War. Maine wasn't exactly a hotbed of the American Civil War. It was well outside of the war. I don't know what the heck. It was like an industrial accident that happened or something, and now ghosts are haunting the place, and it's so bad, and they rarely seem to go to it. It's just not interesting, and there's so little story here that he just spreads, like one tiny little bit of butter being spread over an entire loaf of bread. It's just, it is not there. It is boring. It is not scary. The acting is tolerable, I suppose, but who cares if it's so terrible? And most importantly, there's one episode in this written by Stephen King's wife, and this doesn't disparage her in any way because she is a very good writer on her own, but it is maybe the worst thing ever in any Stephen King work. Ever. Really, I mean it. Of all of them, this is the worst, without question. Even worse than Rose Red. There's a segment here where, I'm not kidding, they take an hour-long break from their story, their ghost story that we're supposed to be hearing about, to tell a time travel story about baseball. about a baseball game that goes really badly for a team that these people like, and so time travel is involved in order to reroute the game so the good team will win. Who is this designed for? Who is watching this? Is it people who want to be scared? Because obviously, unless they are perpetually scared on their own anyway, they couldn't possibly be scared by this. Toddlers couldn't be scared by this. People who are already in a state of frantic terror would actually be calmed down by watching this. That's how unscary it is. Why does this exist? So anyway, after that episode of utter ridiculousness, they actually settle down a little bit and kind of conclude the story or something about a bunch of kids that died in a factory and they're ghosts or something. Everything about this project is a waste of money. It's boring, it's barely watchable, it's not funny. I don't know why these works seem to hinge on humor so often, but they're not even faintly passable even as a soap opera, much less as a horror story. It's terrible. After watching Kingdom Hospital years ago, I decided I was going to ease back on the old Stephen King television works, and maybe even his filmic experience too. He just can't get his style translated correctly onto the screen. Whether he does it or somebody else does it, it just doesn't work.
Is this still between time?
This is stop time. Now, it starts again. And whatever happens, it's up to him.
So, those were the Stephen King miniseries during their heyday in the 1990s. I haven't seen every single one of them, but I saw most of them back in the day, and I wanted to make this video because it's part of my past. I've watched so many of them over the years, and I think about them a fair bit, because as terrible as they often can be, to be honest, I actually kind of enjoy them. Even the terrible ones have a Sci-Fi Channel original movie type feel to them, in that they're so bad they're good. Or more accurately, I think they're kind of perfect distraction material. They're not something that usually you can sit down and watch, but it's nice to have like 6 hours of a story going on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, where you're kind of busy doing a bunch of things, maybe having people over, maybe making dinner, maybe cleaning the house or doing something else. They're good to kind of keep on in the background while you're engaged in something else, just in case there's sort of a lull in what you're doing for 5 or 10 minutes, and you can look at it and then go back to what you're doing periodically. It's just something that sort of keeps things going while you're, so you don't get too bored and distracted. And I also find that they're really useful for writing and developing things. For when I sit down and write a story, or try to write a screenplay, or try to write one of these videos, for instance, I find it really helpful to put on the Stephen King miniseries for 3 or 4 or whatever hours I'm going to be doing this, because I want to concentrate on writing it, but I can't write constantly for hours and hours and hours, and I have to periodically take breaks. And because I've seen them all so often, I know the stories so well, I can tune in and out of them whenever I want to. And the stories are so simplistic that I can just fade in and out at any time. It really doesn't distract me to constantly be doing something else. They're just great sort of white noise in the background of what you're doing. But enough of that. Please tell me in the comments below if you've seen any of these and what you thought of them. Do you think any of them are good? Do you agree with the ones I said were good? Do you think the ones I said were terrible actually have some merit to them that I'm just not seeing? Please tell me about that. I want to know what you think. What do you think is the Stephen King story that really should have been adapted but hasn't, or how one of these stories should have been adapted but they got it so completely wrong? And please tell me if there are any other series that you've seen of his, either TV shows or miniseries or whatever, that I haven't watched, I didn't mention here, that you actually think are good, because I would like to check it out. I'd like to see what it's all about. And yeah, please like this video if you liked it. My name is Michael. Please subscribe to this channel if you want to see more discussions of movies, television shows, and video games. I'm definitely going to be talking about more Stephen King stuff at some point. I do want to see the new It movie that they released last year, and probably want to check out the Mist television series that they had on Netflix for a while. And, yeah, thank you very much, and have a